Before I start, I'd just like to remind everybody that the issue number 6 of the Freedom magazine is out, full of exciting, interesting things, such as smartphones. Are they really addictive? Is a question they're asking. Brainwashing, how it's done and how to avoid it. And Underground Granny Part 6. That sounds interesting. Plus a whole load of more. LED lights, a threat to health and privacy. So that's it's great to see the Freedom magazine increasing its number of articles and interesting subjects. So that's out if you're interested. That's from the White Rose. And of course, the Light newspaper with Enemies of the State. We must stop fighting amongst ourselves. Which is absolutely true. It does seem that in the people who are aware of the tyranny that's being played on us are very much infighting, name-calling, and all the things. Divide and conquer seems to be the issue of the day. And instead of fighting among ourselves, we actually do know who the real enemy is. It's not like we don't know anymore. And yet we seem to be quite happy to just have a punch up amongst ourselves instead of going, hang on a minute, it's you lot who are dictating the tyranny that is amongst us. So lots of other interesting things in the Light paper. Of course, I'll put the links in the description. You probably know them anyway. What I wanted to say today, some months ago, I did a video in which I was saying, look, freedom of speech is under threat. A lot of people think that when you give an opinion, and I give a lot of opinions in my monologues, that if you disagree with it, that makes the other person an idiot or someone who should be shut up. Now, my view on that is, I think it was Voltaire, wasn't it, who said, I may disagree with you wholeheartedly, but I defend the right for you to say it. I've paraphrased what he said. I think it was Voltaire. And it seems to me that we all ought to have the right to say whatever we damn well like. I appreciate that certain platforms that we do this will have their terms and conditions. And their terms and conditions, I understand and accept that they will have those terms and conditions because they are offering a free service to put your opinions on them so they can confine them. That's fair enough. But if you're out in the public streets or in a public park or on the beach, or you've got a gathering of people that you've hired a hall for a private meeting, which perhaps is invitation only, or people buy a ticket to come and see you, and you're sharing ideas, whether they're repulsive to some people or abhorrent, they ought to be allowed to be shared, unless, of course, they are instigating violence and nastiness against other innocent people. If they're challenging different authorities, whether that be a government or a council or a corporation or a private company, then if that should be allowed, provided they're not, as I say, inciting violence or danger to those companies. We can all have an opinion and say, actually, this person is wrong in the way they're thinking and they're right in the way they're thinking. It's just an opinion, and people can agree and disagree, and hopefully they can agree and disagree agreeably. And that seems to me to be a great way forward. So I made a video saying what we really want is as many people who have never made a video before, perhaps on YouTube or Rumble or any of the other platforms, Odyssey, etc., BitChute, to voice their opinion so that those people who think it's right to shut down people's opinions have a game of whack-a-mole so that they're continually trying to sort of chase after them. They shouldn't have to do that. That should not be allowed, the whack-a-mole. People should have the right to have their view. Now, I know that in an authoritative government, if you like, or an authoritative authority, They don't want other people to have a difference of opinion. They said, well, this is the narrative and this is what you're all supposed to think. And of course, they've made a very successful job of that with the mainstream media by taking the mainstream media and saying, this is the narrative and you must stick to telling this story so people believe it. And of course, sadly, a lot of people have gone, oh, I trust implicitly the BBC or any of the other channels that they watch, and they wouldn't possibly lie to us. Well, we only have to go back to Brexit and you can see that there was huge bias. It didn't matter which side of the coin you were on, you could see that there was a bias that the mainstream media wanted to push you. And that's true, I think, with government, with all of their legislation, are trying to get you to think in a certain way. But we as ordinary everyday people living in a peaceful society, people who just want to get on with their lives, ought to be, and they're the ones in charge after all, they put the government into position, ought to be able to just challenge it and say, actually, I don't think what you're suggesting is right and has any benefits to us, and we would like you to change it. I don't think there's any harm in that, surely. Now, the people in the government, the people in the councils, the people in authority may say, oh, but we can't have them saying that because we want to railroad them in this direction. Well, nobody should be railroaded in any direction, and that's my opinion. Now today, so that was a video I made before, and I suppose I'm just reiterating that at this moment in time. But also, it's interesting that the people who are most susceptible to this mainstream narrative are those who are in the younger generation, who perhaps have not seen a more relaxed way of living their lives. And we've seen a lot of young people, through no fault of their own, through the fact that they just haven't lived in the same time period as perhaps older people, perhaps those people in the analog world, where they had to do things much more the hard way. Things weren't just like on a phone where you just swipe the screen and press a button. People, for example, would have to go to the library if they wanted to find out information from books, or a bookshop and get that, or they'd have to go to meetings or talk to their elders or what have you. They couldn't just rely on the internet, you know, and just easily get stuff. They couldn't do that in the old days. And I think it would be worth older people, and by older people I'm saying like 50 plus, people of that age plus, recording their memories of what life was like in their formative years, in their days when they were growing up. Because I think that there would be huge benefit for younger people to realise that things have changed, and changed quite dramatically. Now, I don't know whether young people will accept what older people's opinions are, but they can relate to how life was. Because it seems to me, looking around in the very busy and surveilled landscape that we find ourselves in at the moment, that life was much simpler. Now, admittedly, I think that when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, there were still nefarious ideas. There was still authority trying to push us in one direction. There was still mainstream media trying to propagandize our minds and keep us within certain narrow spheres. I feel that narrow sphere has increased, and that people cannot, younger people, do not have that advantage of having lived in those days, and so they cannot see outside the box, as it were. And that's where I think it would be very useful for older people to more and more record what it was like in the old days, because I think that what it was like in the old days is something that is trying to be eradicated, so that people, for example, in the old days, you didn't see those streaks in the sky that many of us call chemtrails, or geoengineering, to give it a more scientific name. We didn't see that. Now when we look up in the sky, we see that and we can go, my goodness, that was never a thing. And then if you watch it, you can see how it affects the weather. And we've seen that sort of thing. Before the advent of digital, for example, everything was a lot more long-winded. You interacted with a lot more people. If you wanted to see them, you'd go down to the pub, you'd have meeting rooms, there were youth centres. People got on. You weren't stuck behind screens. You weren't addicted to your phone. I mean, a telephone for me was very expensive, and my mother and father would always say when I was ringing up a friend to find out if they wanted to come out and play, or you were having those conversations, it was always, don't be long on the phone, because things were quite expensive. Modern technology was quite expensive. It's hard for younger people to believe that we ever existed without the internet or mobile phones and all of this. I would love younger people to understand that the surveillance that we're under, the control that is ever seeping, that it seems that the majority of the over 50s actually are beginning to become aware of, is not a normal situation. That in the past, when you were spending your money and you went into independent shops, you weren't under the guise or the beady eye of cameras, and these weren't big corporations trying to make a massive profit all the time. I mean, the example that I often give, of course, is the sweet shop, that you'd go into the sweet shop and there would be the big triangular Avery weighing scales, and you'd say, oh, can I have a quarter of sherbet lemons, please? And the friendly shopkeeper would, well, mostly the friendly shopkeeper, but he knew that he wanted to keep you as a customer, and he was very nice and benevolent to you. And as he was putting in the sweets, you would see the needle go up to the quarter, and he would drop a couple more in, so the needle went over, and you thought, oh golly, he hasn't noticed. And then you'd get your bag of sweets in a little paper bag, and away you'd go, and you'd eat these sugary things which were there to rot your teeth. That bit hasn't changed, I grant you. But there was something about these small independent shops which was noble and in many ways right. And you felt, I mean, I worked when I left school for a printing firm. I left at 15, and I worked for a printing firm. And I was lucky that this was a small firm. Again, it was run by 3 directors. They all knew each other. It was a one-off company. It was sort of family run, if you like, but it wasn't a family, but they were mates. And you felt part of a team. And they were very nice. They did get me to work overtime, and then they rewarded me in ways that I could never really, you'd never see today. You could go into a shop, for example, and very often you would buy something and you might not have the exact amount of money. Well, sometimes in the old days they'd say, oh, don't worry about the odd 5p or the 10 pence, you know, that's fine. I know you'll be back. And those sort of things would be lovely. It took away the stress. Nowadays, you go into a supermarket. I haven't been in a supermarket for a year, not a big one, and certainly not the one near me that I understand now has these AI cameras on every shelf. And on the ceiling, there are cameras looking down at you, monitoring everything you take, and of course, taking your facial recognition, so that it knows exactly what you've bought and how much, so that in the future it can start to tell you whether you've had too much salt or too much red meat or too much of something that you shouldn't be having, and they want to control you. But in the old days, yes, you could go in and you felt that there was service, that you were a valued customer. Nowadays, I don't think we are a valued customer. We're just a number. And your call, if you ring them, is very important to them, they say. And then you find that the line goes dead. Yes, the corporation takeover, the big corporates and the pretend companies or the pretend farms. You know, you go to some supermarkets and you look at the label and it looks like it's a nice old-fashioned farm, only to realise that the farm name is actually just a brand name for one of the supermarkets, and that they don't farm in that way at all. It's all pseudo truth, lies, pretending that something is the way it is. The standards are very low, and you have to look really hard to see all the different chemicals that are in your food. I think there would be a huge advantage in people recording their memories of going back 20, 30, 40 years, days before the internet, so that young people understand the freedoms and the breadth of what life was about. Yes, it was in many ways it was more difficult because you didn't have the technology to do anything, but you were more responsible, and there was a certain amount of pride and a sense of achievement. When you, particularly in buying things, we've become so consumer focused these days that everything that you've got to have it now. You can buy it now but pay later, and often what you're paying for later has fallen apart, and you're ready to buy the next thing. The whole process of getting into debt, just borrow the money, it doesn't really matter, borrow the money, and the debt ever increases. And yet in the old days, people had that feeling that, well, if I haven't got the money, I can't get it. And now people may say, but having credit, getting the credit or borrowing and getting into debt is a useful thing, so you can buy everything. Your house can have everything you ever want. But in a way, I would argue, where's the fun in that? When I got married in my very early 30s, well, my late 20s, and we moved into a flat, we couldn't afford a washing machine. And we had a little baby called Stanley, my eldest son now. And in order to wash, and we had Terry's nappies, which were these cloth nappies, not the plastic ones that fill up the landfill left, right and centre. And we had a twin tub. Now, a lot of young people would not understand what that means. And you had, and this was a second hand. We couldn't afford a new washing machine, not a front loader. That was, that was incredibly, you had to be well off to have one of those. We had this twin tub, second-hand twin tubs that you'd fill up with a hose that connected to the taps. You fill up the first bit, which would agitate the washing in one compartment, and then when that had completed its cycle, or had gone on for, I don't know, half an hour, whatever it was, and you put your soap powder in and all of that, you had these big wooden tongs. You took each one out and put into the other compartment, twin tub, you see, and it had a spinner on it. And then you would put this little rubber top on it. I'm sure many people remember these. And it would spin at so many revolutions a second. And then it would spin out the water. And all the water, again, you had this hose that went into the sink in the kitchen. And it would take all the water out. And then you would hang it up on the line or wherever you would hang it. And that was the process. And it was pretty much I suppose one of the early steps from actually taking the washing down to the river or in the bath or whatever, first mechanization, if you like. And that's like only 30 years ago. And of course, people used to have these big copper pots, much going back to sort of, I suppose, the 1930s, 20s and the Victorian era, where they'd have these big copper pots and they would heat them up over a big stove in the big houses. And all that, and you try and wash these things, or in tin baths and that sort of thing. The reason I think that this is very useful for younger people to understand is that we used to do stuff. We used to do stuff for ourselves, and there was a sense of pride. There was a sense of freedom, that you didn't have the dictating authorities telling you how to live your life. You could, when I had a car, for example, you could buy a Haynes manual, strip your car down yourself. You had a certain autonomy, if you felt inclined to it, to buy some basic tools. And I had a Vauxhall Viva, and I remember changing the steering rack on a Vauxhall Viva myself. Nowadays, you can't do anything with your car. It's all computer generated. And to even have it looked at, just to get the diagnostics of what is wrong with your car, you have to go and pay something like £80 just for someone to plug the thing into a computer. It seems that today it's all about taking money, from every different avenue, for every different thing. You can't even park your car these days on the streets without A, having to pay, or B, having to pay but using a mobile phone. That we're being ever more pushed into one very narrow sphere of existence. Whereas in the past, you could use the change in your pocket if you had to pay, and you'd have a paying meter, and it was much cheaper. Life incredibly seemed a lot cheaper. And if you go back when I was a kid, at first, only my dad went to work, and one parent could earn enough to support the family. Now it seems the cost of living, you have to have both parents go out, the children have to go to a school, and then they have to have after school activities, or they come home and they just sit in front of a television. They have no notion of what they're eating because it's just ping food. It's nutrient free, without any vitamins or goodness in them, and it's full of food colouring and all the other stuff. And life has changed so dramatically in one time, and I think that so much of what life is about has been removed from us. And that's why I would encourage people to talk about their lives and how things were, so that younger people who may watch things like TikTok and YouTube and all these other platforms, Instagram and so forth, could get an idea that actually there was a time when life was freer. We took more responsibility for our lives. We were able to take more decisions for ourselves. We spent more time reading books and educated ourselves in a way that is totally different to today. We could ask questions about things. We could have opinions, and we could have free speech. And I think young people are desperately, they know that their life is being curtailed in some fashion, but they don't know why. And I think part of our job as the signposts of what went on before and the freedoms that we have had, and we've seen those freedoms being slowly eroded by this ever increasing so-called, it's for our benefit, you know, after the medical intervention, many more of our freedoms have been taken away. After the business with the IRA, many freedoms were taken away. We know where they want us to be with these 15-minute cities, with these digital IDs, with these surveillance everywhere, with the 5G towers. We know what's going on, and the young people are walking blindly into accepting that, because they have no notion of perhaps some of the freedoms they ought to be having now that have been taken from them by just acquiescing, to question everything, to say, do I want to have your system? Do I give you my consent? These are the things I think that youngsters are desperately in need of and would resonate with, if only more of us would actually start to let them know in the formats that they use of how life used to be. Because really and truly, it's their lives and their children, our grandchildren's lives, that are at stake. Many of us in their 60s and above, we've had reasonably good lives. But it's the next generation who are being brainwashed in this corporate takeover world that need to have their minds just opened a little bit to the fact that actually perhaps the life they're leading now is not necessarily the only life that they could have, and that by knowing a little bit more about how things used to be done, it might expand their ideas and their reasoning to say, hold on a minute, I would like to take more responsibility for my life. I would like to say no to that policy. I would like to be more in the private, so that when I buy something, there's no cameras, no people spying on me and knowing everything that I do, albeit under the guise of it's for your benefit. Well, I'm not convinced it is for my benefit, or for the benefit of my children or my grandchildren. And I would like them to be able to have their own opinion on that rather than the authorities one.